then. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Fiona Cunningham, and I am a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's my honor and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on engaging China in nuclear arms control. I'd also like to thank the Japanese Embassy in Washington, D.C. for supporting this event. And this panel could not be more timely because nuclear weapons are becoming an increasingly important aspect of US-China relations. And this is no longer or not just a problem for Washington and Beijing. It is an increasingly serious problem for other countries in the Indo-Pacific region who'd be on the front lines of any US-China confrontation, for Europe, given the interactions with the NATO-Russia nuclear relationship and the US-China nuclear relationship, and for the rest of the globe that will be affected by increasing US-China strategic competition. And the risks of both nuclear weapons use in a crisis or a conflict and an arms buildup between the United States and China are not necessarily new, but they are being accentuated by a number of different factors. Most obviously, US-China relations have taken a competitive turn in recent years that have led both countries to see each other's nuclear weapons as more threatening. U.S. Russia arms control has also unraveled in recent years, which affects Beijing's assessments of both the United States as an arms control partner and its assessments of the kind of U.S. arsenal it's going to need to deter in the future. Of course, China's nuclear modernization is also raising questions about the future trajectory of its nuclear posture. And China is fielding a larger arsenal and new types of nuclear capabilities that may be consistent with its no first use policy, but give its leaders more flexibility in how they might use nuclear weapons in the future. And finally, these two states cannot focus narrowly on nuclear weapons only in their assessments of the risk of an arms buildup or the use of nuclear weapons in a future conflict scenario. Non-nuclear capabilities, whether counter-space weapons, missile defense, offensive cyber capabilities, and conventional missiles, are changing the nuclear landscape in ways these two countries cannot ignore. In addition to these challenges, there's also no clear model for US-China arms control because of asymmetries in the bilateral relationship. Perhaps most obviously, China's nuclear arsenal is much smaller than the US arsenal, but the two countries also have different nuclear strategies, and China doesn't extend nuclear deterrence to allies like the United States does. So to overcome this suite of challenges, we urgently need creative, politically feasible, and mutually beneficial arms control proposals to move forward on the US-China nuclear relationship. And indeed, that is why we are here today. This event is the second in a series on the future of arms control that the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace has held, the first of which took place in December and examined engagement with Russia. And I'd encourage all of you to read the interim progress report on revamping nuclear arms control. It includes two near-term proposals that touch on US-China nuclear relations, and the authors, my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment, James Acton, Thomas McDonald, and Pranay Vadi, would warmly welcome your feedback on these proposals. So I'll now quickly introduce our panelists in the order that they'll be speaking, and each speaker will then take 5 minutes to offer some opening remarks before we have a discussion and turn to questions from the audience. So James Acton holds the Jessica T. Mathews Chair and is co-director of the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a physicist by training, and his current research focuses on the escalation risks of advanced conventional weapons and the future of arms control. And his work will be familiar to many of you who are joining us today. Tong Zhao is a senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based in Beijing at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Thank you, Tong, for joining us at this late hour in the evening in Beijing. In addition to many recent publications on how China could be engaged in arms control, Tong has also published monographs on China's ballistic missile submarine capability and on Chinese views of US missile defense. Nicola Leveringhaus is assistant professor in war studies at King's College London, where she specializes in the international relations of East Asia. Her current research falls under 3 areas: early Chinese nuclear weapons history, contemporary China-India nuclear relations, and conceptions of responsibility across regional and global forms of nuclear order. And I'd commend to all of you her book on China and global nuclear order. And finally, but by no means least, we have Nobumasa Akiyama, who is professor at the Graduate School of Law and the School of International and Public Policy at Hitotsubashi University in Japan, who is also joining us at a very late hour. So thank you, Professor. Professor Akiyama's publications span issues of non-proliferation, Japan's nuclear security, and nuclear energy. So without further ado, I will turn it over to James Acton to start the conversation.
Thanks very much, Fiona. And it's not just my co-panelists who are here doing this very late at night, it's Fiona too. So many thanks to you for doing this, Fiona. Let me give a shout out firstly to Pranay Vadi and TD McDonald, who are co-authors on the piece that I'm going to be presenting today, which, as Fiona mentioned, is part of our thinking about the future of arms control, both US Russia and how to catalyze progress with China. The paper that Fiona mentioned that you can download is genuinely intended to be a working paper. We invite feedback on this proposal and other proposals in order to refine these proposals before republishing them at the end of this year. The specific proposal I'm going to talk about today focuses on how to manage the US-China nuclear relationship, which was something that the Trump administration emphasized. And the Trump administration expressed concern about the possibility of a large-scale Chinese buildup in nuclear weapons and proposed trilateral limitations with the US, Russia, and China as a way to manage that concern. Interestingly, if you look at what the US intelligence community has said about China's nuclear arsenal, and even more importantly, China's fissile material stockpiles, that is the highly enriched uranium and the separated plutonium that are the basic ingredients for nuclear weapons. The Defense Intelligence Agency suggests that that China only has enough fissile material to build a total stockpile of several hundred nuclear weapons. Nuclear warheads, I should be more precise there. Whereas the US stockpile is for around about 4,000 nuclear warheads. And more than that, it appears that China is not currently producing more fissile material for nuclear weapons. So if the US concern is about China, so-called Chinese sprint to parity, or China kind of rapidly trying to build up its arsenal, you don't necessarily have to deal with this problem directly by limiting Chinese warheads or weapons. You can deal with this problem on the fissile material end. So specifically, we make two proposals here. Firstly, that the US and China could agree to a bilateral cutoff in fissile material production, that each one of them will commit not to produce any fissile material, and that they further commit to talks over targeted verification measures. That is specifically that if either of them has any concerns about the other's compliance, they could try to negotiate targeted measures to address those specific concerns as opposed to some broader overarching verification regime. In the paper, we discuss at considerable length what those verification measures could look like. I'm not going to go into verification detail today. And then having declared this bilateral fissile material cutoff, we suggest that the US and China could then exchange data about their fissile material stockpiles. Specifically, how much fissile material in various categories they currently have. Now, let's acknowledge right from the outset that as it's currently phrased, this proposal is pretty good from a US perspective. The US has already announced publicly that it's not going to cut off, that it has cut off fissile material production. It's released data on its stockpile of fissile material publicly. China, by contrast, while it's believed to have ceased production of fissile material, has not formally announced a cutoff in production, presumably because it wants to retain the option to produce more fissile material. Indeed, there's some evidence, and I don't want to overstate this, but some evidence of building one of its plutonium production facilities that could be interpreted as making that option more real of producing more plutonium. So the question is obviously, like, what's in this proposal for China? Well, the first thing to say is I think this proposal is hopefully more acceptable to China than the Trump administration's proposal of formal negotiations and limits on nuclear warhead and limits on nuclear weapons. Such limits would inevitably give, China would have to start declaring exact weapon numbers, locations for inspections. That would exacerbate Chinese concerns about the survivability of its nuclear forces. This cutoff proposal here would give a general idea of roughly how many nuclear weapons China might have, but would not require nearly so much intrusive data exchange or verification. But secondly, there's going to have to be a quid pro quo here. And this is something the Trump administration never wanted to address. Its view of a quid pro quo was that China would get international kudos by having a seat in the top table, which if I were Chinese wouldn't be particularly attractive to me. So, let me acknowledge that there's going to have to be a quid pro quo here. The US is going to have to give something big up for China in return for this. And in writing this paper, one of the things we wanted to do was not guess what China wanted, but instead to try to start a conversation with Chinese interlocutors and experts and officials and say, what would be the price here? We have proposed what we think is a sensible way of managing concerns of a Chinese buildup. We invite you to have internal discussions and to tell us what you would want in return. Maybe we can reach a deal, maybe we can't, but we don't want to start guessing at what that would be. And with that, let me thank you for your time and attention and hand back to Fiona.
Fabulous. Thank you, James. I'll just remind everybody who's listening that if you would like to submit a question for the event, then please use the YouTube chat or tweet us at Carnegie NPP, all lowercase with no spaces. And I'll turn it over to Tong for his remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Fiona. I have this belief that arms control can be made mutually beneficial between US and China, which means China can better defend its own interests through arms control engagement with US and maybe other countries. But due to the capability asymmetry between US and China in terms of their nuclear programs, we have to come up with some innovative arms control measures, and also to make sure that any arms control proposal would be balanced. Meaning that both China and the United States would benefit relatively equally from such proposals. And in this light, I think one way to do so is to recognize that both US and China has their different advantages in their strategic military capabilities. The US is very strong in terms of strategic nuclear weapons, but weak in terms of land-based medium-range missiles. But China is very strong in the latter, but very relatively weak in terms of strategic nuclear weapons. So one option is to combine those two areas and to set a central limit for the weapons under either the New START Treaty or the INF Treaty. The weapons that are regulated under New START include ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. And the weapons under INF Treaty are about land-based medium-range and intermediate-range missiles, which means missiles that have ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. But if we combine these two types of weapons together, we can have a new arms control framework that basically covers all land-based missiles with a range longer than 500 kilometers, plus SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. There are several benefits to look at this new arms control framework. One, if we only look at the launchers of these weapon systems, it happens that US and Chinese arsenals tend to have similar numbers of such launchers. According to my last count, both US and China have about 600 of such launchers. So this would make US and China equal partners in a future arms control agreement, which I think helps address the asymmetry problem, and also avoids making China a small partner to a major military power. A second benefit is that both countries would have flexibility to decide how to mix their specific capabilities. China can continue prioritizing the development of theater-range missiles for defending its perceived territorial integrity, and can continue maintaining its large strategic forces in order to deter Russia. A third benefit is that we can also include Russia in this agreement and making it a trilateral framework. The benefit of doing so is that in many cases, Russia shares similar interests and concerns with China. And as a newcomer, China may feel intimidated for attending a formal arms control negotiation, but with Russia on its side, which also has a richer experience in arms control negotiation with the United States, that may help increase Chinese confidence in participating. A fourth benefit is that by not looking at missiles or warheads, this makes this arms control framework easier to verify. If we only look at the launchers, it is easier to verify than looking at missiles or warheads. And also, this agreement wouldn't really distinguish nuclear warheads or conventional warheads. Again, this would make it relatively easy to implement and verify if there's a need to verify this agreement. Last benefit is that it offers some flexibility in terms of how far the parties want to go in regulating such weapons. If there is little confidence at the beginning, they can basically start with setting an upper limit of their weapons. In other words, they can choose simply to cap their capabilities. But over time, if they develop greater confidence, they can move towards freezing their capabilities by setting a lower central limit of these weapons. And if things go well, they can gradually move towards a more radical option, which is to set an even lower threshold and to make this agreement arms reduction agreement. So that flexibility, I think, is also useful and offers more potential for more radical steps down the road. And I think it's important to note that this is not meant as a perfect arms control option, but just something for people to start a joint examination, discussion, and debate at track 2 or track 1.5 levels. And participants in such discussions can certainly build on this framework and jointly identify maybe even better options to conduct arms control. And I think this process of joint examination and discussion and debate on an arms control model itself can be a useful confidence building measure, because it can help participants from different countries developing more nuanced views about each other's concerns, and may help identify areas for potential cooperation down the road. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tong. So with those two proposals now out on the table, we'll turn it over to Nicola Leveringhaus to continue the discussion.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Thanks, Carnegie, for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the report. I think it really moves the conversation forward on this important topic. And I really liked the focus on fissile material, that the proposal around fissile material cutoff that James began this discussion with. I think I'll center my comments briefly around this concept of a mutually beneficial package, the term that appears a lot in the report, and also potential motivations for China behind some of these proposals. So in the report itself, it talks about a mutually beneficial package. And then the sentence that tends to follow is Beijing should start considering what it would ask of Washington, right? And James, you were very clear that, the report wasn't about, trying to second guess Beijing. But I wonder if actually it is problematic, right, to sort of put the ball in China's court. As Tong rightly suggests to us, China is a newcomer to the arms control. It's also a skeptic to arms control. So that's a sort of a double problem. Whereas, of course, the United States is neither a newcomer and fortunately under the current Biden administration is hopefully an enthusiast of and supporter rebuilding arms control. So I wonder if we should also not simply ask the question of what China wants, but also what would the United States stomach? What is the spectrum of palatability for China, for the United States, right? What would they be willing to offer? What would they be willing to accept? And sort of start to sort of populate that question a little bit more in the report. So thinking about it in terms of the proposal, fissile material cutoff proposal, it seems to me that for Beijing, its most pressing concerns are largely going to be regional, which means that the United States, if it's going to offer anything in terms of assurances, it might have to actually go beyond its borders. In other words, it has to start thinking about allies. It has to start thinking about how do we assure the Chinese around their concerns, for instance, about Japan's stockpile of plutonium. I don't want to get onto Nobu's toes in the next few minutes, but that's one area. And of course, that opens the door to other things, like, for instance, non-NPT members and India's own stockpile. Let me now, just in the remaining minutes, also talk a little bit more about the motivations that are set out in, in sort of the assumptions, underlying motivations that are sort of set out for some of these proposals. I think some of the motivations are persuasive, in particular the fact that China would have insight into, new insight into the US stockpile. But some of them are perhaps not so persuasive, in part because China today is not the China of 10, 20 years ago, right? And there's actually been quite a lot of change in sort of foreign and security policy. You could argue that China is today in a position of relative strength compared to the past. It's arguably sort of the strongest nuclear power it's ever been since it became a nuclear weapon state in 1964. Domestically, nuclear weapons play perhaps a renewed, but it's certainly a new and important role. There's a new political value attached to these weapons and in the Xi Jinping era. And I think more importantly for this panel, I think the appeals to China that have typically been made for, joining this table and signing up to these proposals, usually, and they tend to revolve around fear of nuclear war, the cost of not talking, for instance, the risk of an arms race and what that would mean for defense spending and the risks and the damage that it could do potentially to reputation. I'm not sure that these sort of drivers or appeals work so well in the current context of China today, in part because if we take the threat of nuclear war, for instance, I'm not saying that China doesn't dismiss. I think actually China has consistently, historically and still to today, thinks nuclear war is a terrible thing. But it doesn't have a direct experience of a close call, let's put it like that. Like, for instance, propelled or sort of drove initial arms control between the United States and Soviet Union. Remember that when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place, it was the Sino-Indian border war that was going on. So China was preoccupied elsewhere. And when we think about the economic costs or economic damage, well, maybe we should turn it around and think about what would be the economic gains? What would be the economic benefits for China? On issues around image and sort of responsibility, I really think this is a non-starter for the way that we see China today. I don't think that has much traction. I think what has more traction is issues around instability, political instability. Think about post-Fukushima, how that played out in China, domestic panic around that. So issues around nuclear security and safety, I think, have far more traction. And lastly, I'll be very quickly, I think an additional challenge that hasn't really been addressed so far is this issue of insignificance, right? So in a conversation that Mao Zedong had with Henry Kissinger in 1973, he described China's nuclear position when Kissinger was talking about talking about Soviet US arms control. Mao said, we're just a fly, we're insignificant, right? And so the question today is, how do you overcome, right? And one way of overcoming that is thinking about how China is still, very much aware and very much attentive to non-nuclear concerns among the non-nuclear weapon, to nuclear concerns around the non-nuclear weapon states. And I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicola. And we'll now turn to Nobumasa Akiyama.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the 3 presentations before me, and I don't know if there's anything left for me to speak, but probably my role is to provide some comments and questions from Japanese perspective on James' proposal and Tong's idea. So let me first address the James and others' excellent paper on how to revamp nuclear arms control and how to reduce the risk of arms race escalation. I think, after reading the report, I found that the 5 proposals are very concrete and they sound very practical. And given that the current strategic environment surrounding 3 major powers is quite rough, and it's not well suited to advancing the negotiation for the follow-on treaty of the New START, and it is, I think, a good idea to propose that the U.S., Russia, and China should seek harvesting so-called somewhat low-hanging fruits so that they could re-establish habit of cooperation and realize or re-realize the benefit of arms control for their national security. So in particular, with the great divergence of views on arms control and strategic stability, the United States and China need to build on small successes to improve mutual trust, which is the basis for the dialogue for more substantive arms control and confidence building measures, which actually Tong had suggested. And in this respect, I think the cut-off fissile material can be a good start point. And having said so, I have a couple of questions on this, the mutual cut-off of the fissile materials. First, I wonder how to ensure that Chinese reprocessing plants and reactors are used exclusive for civilian purposes, or in other words, is civilian military separation possible for Chinese fissile material production? Then how can we ensure it? And possibly, I'm wondering if China has submitted the report to the IAEA based on INFSAC 459, that is the guideline for the management of plutonium, and if that would be kind of a one way to ensure the separation of civilian and military fissile material production, particularly in plutonium, then I think that could be more even the sort of very first start of this cut-off sort of a process. And second, for the gaining and confidence on trustworthy verification, do you think that both China and the United States need to establish a baseline for the in a way to make kind of initial declaration on how much of fissile materials they possess at this moment? Do you think it's necessary, or if it's not necessary, then how can we establish confidence on the cut-off commitment? And so then also in the report, James, you suggested that for the verification, China and the United States should utilize their national technical means. And I wonder if China has the capacity which would be able to satisfactorily meet the verification requirements. So these are the questions to the James proposal. And next, I would like to ask Tong a couple of things. First, the proposal is really excellent, and the combining the INF range missiles and strategic missiles to create new arms control framework is an innovative and worthwhile take a close look at. But I actually read your article on arms control today, and I got a couple of issues from that article as well. And I agree that I think that in your proposal, you you also said the if U.S. objective is is to seek and gain the sort of competitive advantage vis-a-vis China through arms control, then China will not accept any deal. And China needs sort of equality or an equal and fair proposal. And I agree. And I'm sure that China would not really buy the idea of arms control modality, which put itself in a disadvantageous position. So I think that is a very important sort of elements or the principle that the arms control between China and the United States seek. And obviously, acquiring competitive advantage is often a hidden agenda for the arms control, but at the same time, it should not be explicit and like in the previous administration of the United States. Then on this combining INF and the sort of strategic missiles, I wonder if that is what sort of the concept of strategic stability are you based on? As Fiona outlined, the current complex strategic environment in East Asia involves the strategic nuclear conventional entanglement, which is defined by James, and also a lot of other capabilities and emerging technologies, including missile defense, cyber space, and so forth. So then, do you think it's sufficient enough to sort of only combine INF range missiles and strategic missiles putting into the arms control framework, or do we have to seek sort of more comprehensive framework, or we just simply cut off these two nuclear capabilities from other capabilities? And I wonder if it's possible or not. And then also, once again, from the Tong's paper in arms control today, he suggested that the United States and Russia should invite Chinese observers to the U.S. Russia verification activities. Now, Open Sky treaty is dead, and then the verification activities based on the New START is subject to the re-extension. But I think it's a very good sort of idea, because I think that kind of activities probably would be a very important process for educating Chinese strategic community on the usefulness and importance of verification transparency. And also, it is useful for U.S. and Russian strategic community to encounter different strategic cultures, and that would be a very that will facilitate mutual understanding in both different strategic communities. So then, from Japanese perspective, I think I would like to add a couple of footnotes for the advancement of U.S.-China arms control. And first, it's about the definition of strategic stability in Asia. As I said, the entanglement between nuclear and conventional is probably now obvious, and that actually, in fact, requires a lot of support and also the commitment of allies of the United States if the US would like to maintain credible, effective deterrence in the region. So, if the Japan, ROK, and Australia, those allies of the United States, are deeply involved in the effective and up-to-date US deterrence, then I think inevitably, the dialogue or conversation on strategic stability or arms control modality may have to involve those allies as well. But traditionally, the nuclear arms control has been discussed only among the nuclear armed states. So, to what extent it would be possible to involve the Asian allies of the United States in such kind of a dialogue. And also, secondly, it seems to me that now the Biden administration puts a priority on reestablishing sort of arms control process with Russia and view dialogue with China as a medium and a long-term item among arms control agenda. And if it frames strategic competition with China, it actually, the Biden administration frames its strategic competition with China mainly around the economic and the technological sphere. And in this situation, you know, how we could get started the consultation and the dialogue on the nuclear or broader sort of strategic arms control between China and the United States, which involves the Asian allies, hopefully from our perspective. And so I would like to ask both speakers, the way or necessity of involving Asian allies of the United States in such a dialogue. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nobu, for those very comprehensive remarks. I'm just going to pose one very quick question, given that we have so much on the table and limited time to get questions in from the audience as well, which actually follows on very nicely from the last point that Nobu posed, which is how much of a priority is arms control for Chinese and US leaders, given the plethora of other pressing issues in the bilateral relationship that will be on the table for those leaders to take ahead? So can the United States and China move forward on these kinds of proposals that have been put on the table by Tong and James without the president and the general secretary making arms control a personal priority? So I'll turn over to each of the panels, and we might start with James in the order that we went through to comment on that, and then move to the audience questions.
Thanks, Fiona. I will just, Nobu and Nicola and you put a ton on the table, and I'm not going to try and respond to everything. I just want to kind of pick up a few critical pieces. Let me end with where you started, which is how much of a priority. I mean, I think it's clearly not a priority for Chinese leaders right now. I think it remains to be seen how much of a priority the Biden administration makes arms control with China. I would just say as a practical matter, like, I think if the president is not personally invested in this, it's definitely not going to happen. If he is personally invested in it, it's still going to be really difficult. But I think, the president is going to have to engage Chairman Xi directly to have any chance of any of this happening. I think in terms of the question about engagement with allies, it's critically important that the US engages allies. Whether allies are a direct participant in the negotiation, I think depends on the proposal, right? If it's a proposal that would limit Japanese fissile material as well as Chinese, as well as the US fissile material, Japan obviously has to be there in the room. What I'm proposing here is a purely US-Chinese bilateral conversation agreement. So, it would just be the US and China in the room negotiating the details. But that doesn't mean that doesn't in no way preclude having very intensive allied consultations on the side of any bilateral negotiations. And actually the INF negotiations in Europe, I think, are a nice example of that. I'd finally say that in terms of, because I think, the question about that Nobu raises about the separation between China's civilian and military reprocessing programs, I'd make a couple of points here. China, I think, is a very long way away from having a functional civilian reprocessing capability. All of the evidence we have suggests that the pilot plants China built and for civilian purposes are not operational. And China's negotiating with France for to build a large-scale reprocessing facility in China. If China proceeds with that, the only solution I can think of is that it has to be under IAEA safeguards. In exactly the same way that Rokkasha reprocessing plant in Japan is under IAEA safeguards. But we're also talking about something that is at least a decade, and frankly, I suspect a lot more from being operational on the civilian side. And so, I think this is something where this could be a real issue, but I would still press on with China and try to agree to a cutoff with the understanding that if China opens a civilian reprocessing plant, that would have to be under IAEA safeguards.
Tong, if you want to jump in.
Okay, I'll be very brief. My specific proposal of thinking about combining New START and INF is just one way to offer a concrete arms control model so that Chinese American experts can start debating and discussing it. Otherwise, our engagement is stored at very empty level. Something concrete would really help offering an opportunity for them to deepen and substantiate their discussions. And that process, I think, could really be useful for developing more nuanced understandings about each other's concerns and thinking and policy. So, and this specific option is certainly not meant to be the entire arms control framework between the two countries in the future. It can be done together in parallel with other options like the fissile material cutoff proposal that James raised, etc. In terms of how to bring in American allies, I think it's critically important to bring in American allies on the issue of U.S.-China strategic stability. One important example is U.S. has been unable to move forward on no first use or sole purpose policy domestically because significantly that American allies are worried about the implications for their security. So I think this is where the discussion needs to be broadened to include US allies. If China, for example, can provide security assurance to American allies, for example, in the form of renouncing the military option, renouncing using military option to resolve territorial disputes with its neighbors, I think that would really help address the security concerns of American allies towards China and may help persuade these allies to drop their opposition against the United States adopting no first use or sole purpose or establishing a more explicit strategic stability relationship with China. So that really benefits China and something I think could incentivize China to examine. And lastly, on the issue of a priority of arms control in U.S. and China, as James mentioned, arms control does not seem to be the priority of Chinese leaders now, but I think it should be one of the priorities because China is also facing important economic incentives. It is cutting huge funds to support social and economic developments during a major pandemic. It really needs to save money, and arms control can help doing so. And more importantly, China needs to stabilize its overall relationship with US, putting some guardrails in the bilateral relationship to avoid a very costly and dangerous arms race. And it wants a more stable bilateral relationship in general. So arms control can be a very important tool for China to advance its interests in those areas. But the way to do it, as James said, is to directly engage with Chinese leaders, the only person that matters in the Chinese system.
So I might just turn it over very briefly to Nobumasa and Nicola, just a minute or so if you have comments on these particular points.
Thank you. I wish that the Chinese policymakers would have a similar thinking as Tong Zhao now present. That would be really helpful, but probably I will be now realistic about it. One thing about the declaratory policy, I think at this moment, because of the absence of confidence between the United States and China or China and US allies, the declaratory policy on both sides may not be so effective in sort of advancing the arms control at this moment. So I think before talking about the declaratory policy, we have to have more sort of a dialogue on strategic issues as well. And also, if the transparency would be improved, particularly in the consistency between the regulatory policy and capability will be improved on China's side, then I think our trust on Chinese policy or Chinese commitment will be far improved. So I think it is probably important from our perspective to discuss how we are going to sort of improve the transparency on both sides, Japan, United States and China, and probably Japan on their regulatory policies and the implementation of such policies. Thank you.
Nicola.
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I don't think there's much of a priority, so I kind of agree with what's been said. But I would say that if you look at past instances where China has come to the table, and of course, it's not about recreating those conditions, but certainly when outside pressure has worked, it's usually when things are going well and China doesn't want to be seen to be sort of missing the boat to some extent. So if the US is serious about a bilateral arrangement, whatever the arrangement be, along sort of the reports lines or some of the great proposals that Tong talks about, it seems to me that it has to answer the question, why just China, right? I mean, if they start to engage in similar bilateral proposals with other nuclear weapon states, then perhaps that would put added pressure on China. So they either have to come up with a brilliant explanation of why just China, or they need to think beyond China and whether that would create pressure perhaps on China to participate.
Thank you very much to all of the panelists for those remarks. So we'll turn to some questions from our audience. Thank you all very much for these terrific questions that are coming in. I'm going to group one from Hiroaki Nakanishi, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Kyoto University, and Brian Redzinski, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which goes to the point of a post-INF framework. And so my question, I'm going to pose it to both Tong as well as to Nicola, of what are the merits of negotiating a post-INF framework which includes China, so a trilateral kind of proposal at the intermediate ranges of nuclear forces, versus the kind of proposal that, Tong, you have put forward, where you would be grouping together the strategic as well as the intermediate range forces. And perhaps Nicola could comment on some of the motivational questions of doing this in a trilateral versus a bilateral context. Tong, if you want to perhaps take a stab at that first.
Yeah, sure. Well, if we only look at a trilateral INF type of agreement, there are still, from the Chinese perspective, then you would need to combine. You would need to look at not only land-based systems but also air and sea-based. You can also combine these three types of weapons together so that you can somewhat address the capability asymmetry problem, but not entirely, because the US will still possesses a huge advantage over China. It's hard to include China in such an agreement as an equal partner. That's why I proposed a different type of way to combining these systems. So I think there are different trade-offs. As long as we can make it work and make it fair and equal and acceptable to all parties, I think that would work. So I think there are many ways we can combine different provisions, and my proposal is certainly one of those possibilities.
Nicola, thanks for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think both bilateral and trilateral are problematic. I don't think one is potentially better than the other, and I don't think for China they're going to. I mean, like Tong said, that whether you're grouping things and what even if you sort of reduce the asymmetry, that may be on the table. I still think when you're thinking about political motivations, it's a very hard sell. I mean, it doesn't seem to me very clear what the benefits are for China to engage in that kind of negotiation. I'm thinking back to back when the INF was negotiated, and even since then, and since its breakdown, I mean, China's preoccupations are so much bigger than a bilateral, trilateral context. And you'd have to bring in, again, as I've mentioned in my initial comments, questions of alliances, and in this case, NATO. And I think it would be a very unwieldy, quite an unwieldy dynamic for negotiations. So I don't see either as particularly a good way forward, unless you can provide a good enough reason for so, or unless there's a rationale, domestic rationale, that's sufficiently strong to push that forward in China.
Thank you, Nicola and Tong. I'm going to take now a question from Twitter where Ryan Fedesuk, apologies if I'm mispronouncing names, and I'll direct this one to James perhaps, and he asks, should we still aim to cap warhead totals or focus narrowly on fissile material productions? And if we should be seeking to cap nuclear warheads, then what does one make of the US 5-year New START extension, and what leverage in particular remains for the US to negotiate with when it comes to China?
Thanks, Fiona, and it's a great question. So we proposed this fissile material proposal precisely because we thought limits on Chinese nuclear forces at the current time were a complete non-starter. I mean, I don't want to be, there are plenty of challenges to our proposal. I don't want to kind of be Pollyannish about this, but to my mind, the idea of limits on Chinese nuclear forces right now are a complete non-starter. So, in the long run, I love the idea of a single limit on all warheads. Strategic, non-strategic, US, Russian, Chinese. I think that's a great long-term goal, but that really is a long-term goal. And I would focus initially on, US, China on one track, US, Russia on a separate track. And, as Tong says, there's lots of ideas that one could go with the US and China. Our proposal is one proposal we add to the mix. I very much like Tong's idea. The question is, can any proposal between the US and China find traction? In terms of how New START plays into US-China, it doesn't, and it never has. I mean, China values New START, I think, precisely because it values limits on US offensive forces. But, the Trump administration's proposal of trying to hold New START's extension hostage to Chinese involvement in trilateral negotiations, to my mind, was never a good idea and was never going to work and didn't work. And that was why the Trump administration eventually had dropped that particular linkage. It maintained other linkage, but not that particular linkage. So, the key to getting China engaged is will Chinese leaders view bilateral arms control with the US as being in China's interest? Can you cook something up that is mutually beneficial? And quite a lot of the discussion today has focused on what that would look like. And actually, I think there's been a number of quite different ideas that have come out today about potential attractions for China. Fundamentally, I come back to this point that it's not up to me to define Chinese interests. It's up to Chinese leaders to define Chinese interests. And, I again encourage, our Chinese colleagues and interlocutors to really have, a conversation about what Beijing's ask for arms control is.
Thank you very much, James. And so I'm going to take one, unfortunately, last question from the audience, because we are starting to get towards the end of our hour, and then I'll turn to each of the panelists to give them an opportunity to give a minute or two of any final remarks that they want to state. But before I do that, I do just want to pose one last question, which I'm taking from Collins Chong from the University of Malaya. And his question I'm going to direct to Nobumasa Akiyama relates to whether or not economic sanctions and threats of sanctions might be used by the United States, presumably as one of the bargaining chips to break the impasse in US-China arms control engagement. And if so, what might be the impact on kind of allied interests in the region that might be used as retaliatory platforms for pushback and for China to signal that it's not adhering to the kinds of tactics the US is is engaging to encourage China into arms control. So I'll put that question out there to Nobu, because I think the regional question of just how much allies in the Indo-Pacific willing to sort of pay, if you like, to see progress on arms control is an important one that we've touched on. So Nobu, if you can respond briefly, and then we'll turn to everyone for some closing remarks.
Thank you. I think that Tom could better address this question, but I think the China is not really probably affected by the economic sanction, its own nuclear policy, and also from the Allies' perspective, one of the most important distinction between Cold War, U.S.-Soviet confrontation and China-U.S. confrontation is that allies of the United States are heavily involved in sort of economically involved in China, and so it is really difficult if we are seriously posed to really decouple everything from China. So I think economic sanction has very limited impact on this agenda of arms control. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nobu. So we might start with Nicola, and then go to James, Tong, and then Nobu for a last minute or two of closing thoughts, and anything else that's been put on the table that you want to.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to add that, China's use of arms control, I've said they're relatively skeptical, but they've also, of course, traditionally always said the United States and Russia have primary responsibility to sort of reduce their nuclear arsenals because they have the largest arsenals. So China's argument that it's too early, right, for it to join that process. And I think today's discussion has also shed some light on how hard as well. It's not just too early, the argument, it's also it's very hard to cook up alluring proposals to incentivize China to join that table. But I think, at the moment, if China's running logic is that it's too early and that these two other countries, the US and Russia, have primary responsibility, if the pressure does increase on China and if proposals become more developed to bring China to the table, then I think the question quickly becomes, when do others join the table, right? When do India, when do Pakistan, when do France, when maybe even North Korea? I think we need to have an answer to that. And I don't see much conversation going on in that area. So I think we need to start thinking beyond China, just as when we think about the China-US context, it's not simply about the US-China context either, even if negotiations would be with just these two parties around the table. Thank you.
James.
Thanks, Fiona. Let me give two closing thoughts. I mean, firstly, historically, China has been generally reluctant to engage in arms control. But when it's engaged, it's actually engaged pretty seriously. In addition to things like the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is obviously well known, there are two pretty serious, at least two that I know of, arms control agreements that China has with Russia. There is a border demarcation agreement that relates to conventional forces. Sorry, it's not a border demarcation. It's an agreement limiting conventional forces in the border region. And there's also a Sino-Russian launch notification arrangement. And both of those are actually, I think, really quite serious agreements. So, I emphasize that because I think there is some precedent. As I say, it can be hard to get China to engage, but when China does engage, it can do so seriously. I'd also raise, I think there's two different ways of thinking about what the incentives for Chinese engagement are. I don't know which one is correct or if either of them are indeed correct. One is Nicola's idea, which is you expand geographically. You bring in the other countries that China is concerned about, whether that is Japan or India or wherever else. The other is kind of like vertically, which is you reason that maybe the reason why China doesn't want to declare a formal cutoff in fissile material is because it's worried about things like US ballistic missile defense, high precision conventional weapons, the kinds of things that can affect China's nuclear forces. And so you have to expand the context by bringing in those US capabilities, right? I don't know which one of those is more attractive to China, if either of them is. But I just want to point out that I think there's kind of these two quite different ways of thinking about how to make these things, how to make arms control attractive to China.
Thanks, James. If Tong and Nobu, just a minute each, and we'll wrap up our proceedings after that.
Thank you. The point I want to make is, I think arms control can be made beneficial to China, but China hasn't recognized that. And as a result, the outside world cannot hope to coerce China or force China into arms control. So sanctions won't work. Basically, the partners have to address China's concerns, etc. I think there are two obstacles for engaging China arms control. One is traditional thinking within China, either traditional traditional insistence on secrecy and non-transparency, and the traditional suspicion of arms control. And that type of obstacles can only be removed if you have support and blessing from China's top leadership on arms control research. So engaging with the top leader, the importance of that cannot be overstated. But secondly, we also need to start engaging with China to discuss specific options so that in case there is political support and blessing, we can have concrete options to work on. And for that front, there is need to have expert level discussions on specific options. It can be bilateral, trilateral, but as long as we have concrete discussions, it may help pave the way for future progress.
Thank you, Tong. Nobu, bring us home.
Yeah, thank you. I think the very important thing is that I think, we, our U.S., China, and possibly allies should start immediately discussing on the importance of arms control. And as Tom said, I think, we have to probably share the sort of common understanding of the importance of arms control and the benefits of arms control for every stakeholders in the regional security. And so in that discussion, I think, the United States and China really need to sort of discuss on kind of what are their strategic interests respectively and how they assess the sort of capabilities and operational doctrines of both sides so that they improve the transparency and confidence. And at the same time, I think, as James suggested, maybe cut off of the fissile material would be an important, very sort of a practical step to harvest the low-hanging fruits, which will be very important step to further advance sort of into more substantive progress. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to all of the panelists and to our terrific audience for these excellent questions. I think we've had a really rich discussion this morning. One of the things that comes out clearly to me is that we still have a lot of work to do to understand what China's motivations and that side of the story might be on engaging on arms control. I want to apologize to those audience members who posed questions we couldn't get to. We had some excellent ones on emerging technology and warhead verification. I'm sure the panelists would be happy to field your questions via email, but I want to just end by saying it's been an honor to moderate this discussion and to thank in particular Erin McLaughlin, Thomas McDonald and the Carnegie events team who've really worked behind the scenes to make this terrific event possible, plus once again to the Japanese Embassy in Washington, DC. Thank you all very much for a terrific discussion. I look forward to continuing